The vegetation had consumed everything. Thick, twisted roots spread across the facade of the old mansion like skeletal fingers, while dry leaves danced in the wind between shattered windows that had not seen light for decades. It was October 2024 when the drone flew over that forgotten property in the countryside of Minas Gerais, capturing images that would make all of Brazil question one of the most disturbing mysteries in its history. There, swallowed by dense forest, lay the answer to a disappearance that had haunted entire generations. On the cold morning of June 15, 1960, the Monteverde family simply vanished. There was no note, no packed suitcases, no farewell to neighbors. Alberto Monteverde, his wife Esperanca, and their 3 children, Marina, 17, Roberto, 15, and little Carmen, only 8, disappeared like smoke, leaving behind a breakfast table still set. Clothes remained hanging on the clothesline, untouched. A mystery was born that would remain unsolved for 64 long years. What you are about to discover goes far beyond a simple missing persons case. This is the story of a prosperous family that kept secrets, of a community that refused to forget, and of a discovery that would change everything we thought we knew about that fateful June morning. Prepare to dive into one of Brazil's most intriguing cases, where every clue uncovered raised 10 new questions, and where the truth proved stranger than any theory ever imagined. The discovery of the abandoned mansion was not accidental. It was the result of decades of searching, of theories whispered during late-night conversations, of relatives who never gave up, and of a new generation of investigators who inherited a puzzle missing crucial pieces. When they finally located the lost property, when cameras captured the ghostly images of a house forgotten by time, one realization became unavoidable. Perhaps the wrong questions had been asked all along. Alberto Monteverde was not an ordinary man. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hands hardened by labor, he had built his empire from nothing. Born into a family of Italian immigrants who arrived in Brazil at the beginning of the 20th century, Alberto grew up watching his father work 18 hours a day in a small grocery store in downtown Belo Horizonte. But Alberto dreamed bigger. He dreamed of land, of ventures that went beyond dusty shelves and narrow aisles. At 25 years old, in 1935, Alberto made his first bold gamble. Using the savings of a decade of relentless work, he purchased a small plot of land on the outskirts of the city and began raising cattle. He had a sharp vision, able to see opportunity where others saw only dry soil. His sun-browned skin always carried the scent of the countryside, and his brown eyes shone with a determination that impressed everyone who met him. In 1940, Alberto met Esperanca Silva at a São João festival in the neighboring town of Sabera. She was a 22-year-old schoolteacher, daughter of a local merchant, with black hair that danced in the wind and a smile that lit up any room. Esperanca was known for her refined intelligence and her ability to discuss anything from literature to politics with equal ease. Her green eyes contrasted with her fair skin, and she spoke with gentle but confident gestures whenever she explained something she cared about. Their courtship lasted 2 years. Every Sunday after Mass, Alberto would visit her, always bringing wildflowers he had picked from his land. They walked the cobblestone streets of Sabera, talking about dreams. Alberto spoke of expanding his businesses. Esperanca shared her desire to open a school for underprivileged children. They married in 1942, in a simple but deeply emotional ceremony at Igreja do Carmo, surrounded by family and friends who would accompany them throughout their lives. Their honeymoon took them to Pocos de Caldas, a train journey that lasted nearly an entire day. Esperanca had never left Minas Gerais before, and watching new landscapes pass by the train window filled her with wonder. Alberto, always attentive, pointed out every detail and promised that one day they would travel the world together. It was a sincere promise, made by a man who truly believed the future held nothing but good things for his family. The early years of marriage were marked by steady growth. Alberto expanded his holdings, acquired more land, and diversified his investments. Esperanca continued teaching, but gradually became more involved in managing the household and helping with administrative matters. Their first child, Marina, was born in 1943, followed by Roberto in 1945 and Carmen in 1951. To outsiders, the Monteverdis were the image of success, hardworking, respected, and deeply rooted in the region. In the early 1950s, Alberto commissioned the construction of a mansion deep in the countryside, far from urban centers. He claimed it would be a symbol of everything he had built, a place of peace, privacy, and legacy. The house was large, isolated, and surrounded by forest. Some locals found the location unsettling, but Alberto dismissed such concerns. He valued isolation. He trusted land more than people. As the years passed, subtle changes began to surface. Neighbors noticed the family grew increasingly withdrawn. Marina stopped attending social events. Roberto abandoned school sports. Esperanza, once warm and talkative, became distant. Rumors spread quietly, arguments, strange visitors, late-night lights deep within the property, but nothing concrete ever surfaced. Then came the morning of June 15, 1960. The milkman arrived as usual and found no one. Breakfast sat untouched. The house was silent. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into years. Searches yielded nothing. No bodies. No evidence of struggle. No explanation. Until 2024. When the drone footage revealed the mansion once more, investigators found sealed rooms, hidden compartments, personal journals, and symbols etched into walls that did not match any known religious or cultural tradition. What they uncovered suggested that the Monteverdi family may not have vanished suddenly, but had been preparing for something they believed was coming. And as the investigation continues, one unsettling question remains unanswered. Did the Monteverdis disappear, or did they choose to leave this world behind? Esperanza was now working at a private school she had opened in Belo Horizonte. They lived in a modest house in the São Lucas neighborhood, but already dreamed of something greater. Alberto had promised his wife that one day he would build her the most beautiful house in the entire countryside of Minas Gerais. It was a promise he repeated often, not as fantasy, but as certainty. Marina was born in March 1943, during a violent storm that plunged the entire city into darkness for 3 days. Esperanza always said her daughter had been born with the strength of nature itself, and indeed, Marina grew into a determined, independent child. She inherited her mother's green eyes and her father's broad forehead, but her personality was entirely her own. From a young age, Marina loved books. She could spend hours reading beneath the mango tree in the backyard, oblivious to the world around her. Stories became her refuge, and words her companions. Roberto arrived 2 years later in January 1945. He was Marina's complete opposite, restless, playful, always searching for adventure. He had curly brown hair and almond-shaped eyes that sparkled with mischief. Roberto loved animals and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. He spent countless hours observing calves on his father's farm, asking endless questions about everything he saw. Alberto often laughed and said the boy had curiosity running through his veins. Carmen Acula was born in April 1952, by which time the family was already established on the rural property Alberto had acquired. She was a sweet, shy child who hid behind her mother's skirts whenever visitors arrived. Yet she possessed a natural talent for drawing. Her childhood artwork decorated every wall of the house, crayon drawings of animals, trees, and imaginary places. Esperanza used to say the youngest daughter had inherited an artistic sensitivity no one else in the family possessed. The Monteverdi property lay 45 kilometers from Belo Horizonte in a region known as Serra dos Cocais. It spanned 200 hectares of fertile land, with rolling green pastures and a crystal-clear river cutting through the property from north to south. At its center stood a 2-story colonial house built exactly to Alberto's specifications. It was Esperanza's greatest pride. The house had 8 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a large kitchen with a wood-burning stove imported from Sao Paulo, and a library where Esperanza kept more than 500 books she had collected over the years. The walls were thick, the ceilings high, and the windows wide, allowing light to flood the rooms during the day. From the outside, it looked like a place of peace and permanence, a monument to success. Daily life followed a calm, predictable rhythm. Alberto woke at 5 every morning to inspect the cattle and speak with the workers. Esperanza rose at 6 to prepare breakfast and organize the children's routines. Marina, who had turned 17 in 1960, helped her mother with household tasks while studying for the university entrance exam she would take at the end of the year. She dreamed of studying literature at the Federal University of Minas Gerais and becoming a writer. She kept notebooks filled with poems and short stories hidden beneath her mattress. Roberto, at 15, split his time between a boarding school in Belo Horizonte, where he stayed during the week, and the farm on weekends. He had become his father's right hand, displaying a natural talent for business and negotiation. Alberto often said Roberto would be the future of the family, the one who would carry the Monteverde name even further. Carmen, just 8 years old, was the joy of the household. She attended a small school in the nearest town and returned home each day bursting with stories. She had a dog named Treveo, a caramel-colored mixed breed, who followed her everywhere. The two were inseparable. Carmen talked to him as if he were a person, confiding secrets and dreams only he could hear. To outsiders, the Monteverdes seemed like the ideal family, successful, united, respected. But beneath the surface, subtle changes were beginning to form. Marina grew quieter. Esperanza spent longer hours alone in the library. Alberto became increasingly obsessed with privacy, discouraging visitors and limiting contact with neighbors. The isolation of the property, once a symbol of success, slowly became something else, something heavier. And no one realized that these quiet routines, these ordinary mornings and shared meals, were leading toward a day that would freeze time itself. June 15, 1960, the morning when the Monteverde family would vanish without a trace, leaving behind a house full of life, unanswered questions, and a mystery that would echo through Brazil for more than 6 decades. She wandered across the entire property and spent her afternoons drawing beneath the great jabuticaba tree that grew at the center of the courtyard. The Monteverde family was respected and admired throughout the region. Alberto had become one of the most prosperous cattle ranchers in the interior of Minas Gerais, and his businesses continued to expand steadily. He supplied meat to butcher shops in Belo Horizonte and had recently begun exporting to Rio de Janeiro, a milestone that confirmed his status as a man who had truly risen. Esperanza coordinated a group of women who gathered every Thursday to do handicrafts which were sold to benefit the local church. These meetings were lively, filled with conversation, laughter, and quiet pride. To the outside world, the Monteverde family represented stability, success, and moral respectability. But not everything in their lives was as perfect as it appeared. In the months leading up to the disappearance, people close to the family began to notice subtle but unsettling changes in Alberto's behavior. He had grown more reserved, spending long hours locked inside his office. On several occasions, he was seen speaking with unfamiliar men who arrived at the property in expensive cars and left before nightfall. No introductions were made. No explanations were given. Esperanza also seemed troubled. Her closest friends noticed she had lost weight and that her smile no longer carried its familiar warmth. When asked, she brushed off concerns, saying they were merely temporary business issues, nothing worth worrying about. But deep down, her intuition told her something far more serious was unfolding, something she could neither control nor fully understand. Marina, with the heightened sensitivity of adolescence, was the one who felt the shift most intensely. She began keeping a diary, carefully recording her observations about her parents' strange behavior and her own growing anxiety about the future. Those final entries were never found. Whatever she wrote in those pages may have held crucial clues to the events that would soon erase the family from existence. The morning of June 15, 1960, began like any other on the Monteverde property. The sun rose at exactly 6:17 a.m., painting the sky in soft shades of orange that reflected off the calm waters of the river running through the farm. Alberto woke at his usual time, 5 o'clock sharp, just as he had done religiously for the past 20 years. His morning routine was unchanging. A quick cold shower, a strong cup of black coffee, then a walk to the corral to inspect the cattle. That morning, Jose Antonio, the farm's foreman for over 15 years, arrived at 5:40 a.m. for his daily meeting with the owner. He was a trusted man, someone who knew every inch of the land and every head of cattle as if they were his own children. Jose Antonio remembered that morning clearly because he had commented on the dark clouds forming on the horizon, signaling rain later in the day. "Sir, I think it's better to bring the cattle in from the lower pasture today," he said, pointing toward the heavy sky. "That rain looks strong. The stream might overflow." Alberto nodded in agreement, but he seemed distant, more distracted than usual. Jose Antonio noticed something that unsettled him. Alberto checked his pocket watch 3 times during their short conversation. That was unusual. Normally, Alberto lingered over these discussions, asking detailed questions about each animal, debating management strategies, fully present. That morning, he appeared eager to end the conversation. At 6:15 a.m., Alberto returned to the house for breakfast. Esperanza was already in the kitchen, preparing pauta cucar, a tradition on Thursday mornings. The sweet aroma filled the house, blending with the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Marina came downstairs at 6:20, wearing a light blue dress Esperanza had sewn especially for her. She was excited. Later that day, she would receive the results of a practice exam she had taken at school. Roberto had arrived the night before from Belo Horizonte, where he studied during the week. He joined the family at the table, relaxed and talkative, unaware that this ordinary breakfast would be the last they would ever share together. The table was set, cups were filled, bread was broken. Outside, the river flowed quietly and the cattle grazed as they always had. Nothing in that moment suggested that by the end of the day, the Monteverde family would vanish completely, leaving behind a house frozen in time, a community in shock, and a mystery that would haunt Brazil for generations. He studied during the week at São Bento College. It was his habit to return home every Thursday afternoon to spend the weekend on the farm. That morning, Roberto came down for breakfast already dressed in work clothes, ready to help his father with the day's activities. During dinner the previous night, he had mentioned his desire to learn more about the farm's accounting, showing genuine interest in the family business and hinting at a future role he seemed eager to assume. Carmen was the last to join the family in the kitchen at 6:35 a.m., still sleepy and clutching her favorite doll, a small handmade replica Esperanza had sewn from fabric scraps. The girl climbed into the high chair Alberto had built especially for her and began drinking her warm chocolate milk, animatedly recounting a confusing dream about flying horses. Her words tumbled over one another as the adult smiled, indulging her imagination. Breakfast passed normally, filled with the usual conversation about plans for the day. Marina mentioned she would spend the afternoon studying in the library, preparing for an upcoming history exam. Roberto said he wanted to accompany Jose Antonio during the cattle inspection. Carmen asked permission to play by the river after lunch, a request Esperanza denied immediately, pointing to the heavy rain clouds gathering in the sky. At exactly 7 a.m., as he always did, Alberto stood up from the table and kissed the forehead of each family member. It was a daily ritual he never broke, a silent demonstration of affection that officially marked the start of the workday. That morning, however, Esperanza noticed something different. The kiss lingered a few seconds longer than usual, as if Alberto were trying to memorize the moment. Alberto left the house at 7:10 a.m., heading first to the office he had set up in one of the property's annexes. It was a meticulously organized space, dominated by a large wooden desk, shelves packed with documents, and a safe where he kept the most important business papers. Jose Antonio later recalled seeing the office light still on until around 8 a.m., when Alberto finally joined him for the morning cattle inspection. The inspection lasted until 9:15 a.m., and throughout it, Alberto behaved strangely. He asked detailed questions about every farm employee, wanted to know who held keys to which gates, and insisted on personally checking all the property boundaries. Jose Antonio found the behavior unsettling but did not question it. Alberto was a fair employer, but he was also demanding and did not tolerate opposition. At 9:45 a.m., Alberto returned to the main house. Esperanza was in the garden tending her rose bushes, a daily activity that brought her peace after finishing her morning chores. Marina sat on the veranda, reading a book of poetry by Castro Alves, preparing for a school presentation scheduled for the following week. Roberto was with Jose Antonio at the North Pasture, inspecting fences damaged by the previous week's storm. Carmen played in the courtyard with Treveo, the caramel-colored dog, who followed her everywhere. She had built a dollhouse from stones and twigs and explained to the attentive dog how each room should be decorated. It was a perfectly ordinary scene, a calm farm morning, untouched by any sign of the tragedy drawing closer. At 10:15 a.m., a black Ford Galaxy arrived at the property. Jose Antonio remembered the car clearly because it was new and expensive, unlike the vehicles that usually visited the farm. Two men stepped out, one older, with gray hair and a dark suit, and another younger man who stayed near the car. Alberto immediately left the house to greet them, shaking the older man's hand with formal stiffness. The conversation lasted exactly 23 minutes. Jose Antonio knew this because he had checked his watch when the men arrived and again when they left, details he would later provide to investigators. Throughout the exchange, Alberto appeared tense, gesturing sharply and repeatedly glancing toward the house. The gray-haired man spoke in a low voice, his expression stern and intimidating. When the men finally departed at 10:38 a.m., Alberto remained standing in the middle of the courtyard for several minutes, watching the car disappear down the dirt road. From a distance, Jose Antonio noticed that his employer seemed to have aged 10 years in those few minutes. Alberto ran his hands through his hair repeatedly, a gesture he only made when deeply troubled. At 11 a.m., Alberto gathered the family in the main living room. It was highly unusual for him to interrupt everyone in the middle of the morning, and whatever he was about to say would mark the final calm moment before the Monteverdi family crossed the invisible line into mystery. Activities in the middle of the morning, but his voice carried an urgency that allowed no questions. Esperanza left her rose bushes. Marina closed her book of poetry. Roberto ran back from the pasture, and even Carmen, reluctant, abandoned her play in the courtyard. The conversation was brief and mysterious. According to Maria das Dores, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for 8 years, Alberto told the family that they would need to be away for a few days to handle important business matters. He asked them to pack lightly, only the essentials, and to be ready to leave that very morning. Esperanza questioned the need for such haste, but Alberto was categorical. There was no time for explanations. Maria das Dores remembered hearing Esperanza ask about Treveo, Carmen's dog, and Alberto replied that the animal would stay behind on the farm. Carmen began to cry at the thought of leaving her faithful companion, but her mother consoled her, promising they would return in just a few days. By 11:30 a.m., the family began preparing for departure. Marina went upstairs to pack some clothes and books. Roberto retrieved his travel bag from the attic. Carmen, still weeping over being separated from her dog, was helped by her mother to select her favorite dolls. Alberto locked himself in his office for 15 minutes, likely organizing important documents. Maria das Dores prepared a quick lunch, cheese and ham sandwiches, fruits, and a thermos of coffee so the family could eat during the trip. She found it odd that Alberto had not mentioned the destination or how long they would be gone, but did not dare ask directly. At 12:15 p.m., the Monteverdi family climbed into Alberto's blue 1958 Chevrolet Bel Air, a car that was the pride of the farmer. Alberto drove. Esperanza sat in the front passenger seat, while the 3 children settled in the back. Carmen still sobbed, quietly clutching 2 of her favorite dolls. Jose, Antonio, and Maria dos Dores stood on the veranda to see the family off, as they always did when the employers traveled. Alberto waved briefly from the window, his face serious and tense. Esperanza smiled and waved, promising to bring gifts for the staff upon their return. The children waved energetically, oblivious to the underlying tension. The blue Chevrolet Bel Air departed down the dirt road at 12:19 p.m. on June 15, 1960. Jose Antonio remembered the exact time because he had checked his pocket watch as the car disappeared around a curve, vanishing from view forever. That was the last time anyone saw the Monteverde family alive. In the hours that followed, the normal routine of the farm continued. Jose Antonio supervised the gathering of cattle, as planned due to the incoming storm. Maria dos Dores organized the house, put away belongings the family had left behind, and prepared dinner, hoping perhaps that they would return that evening. Trevello spent the day searching for Carmen, running back and forth across the property, whimpering sadly. The anticipated rain began at 5:40 p.m., just as Jose Antonio had predicted. It was a heavy storm, with thunder echoing through the valleys and lightning illuminating the darkened sky. The rain lasted through the night, turning the dirt road into an impassable quagmire. Jose Antonio later speculated that perhaps the family had decided to spend the night in town due to the weather. The first day passed without further concern, the second as well. But when the third day dawned with no word from the family, Jose Antonio began to worry. Alberto had never been absent this long without leaving precise instructions for the farm. He was a methodical man who planned every trip down to the smallest detail and kept in constant contact with his staff. On the fourth day, June 18, 1960, Jose Antonio decided to contact Alberto's brother, Enrique Monteverde, who lived in Belo Horizonte and was a minority partner in some of the family's businesses. The conversation was brief and alarming. Enrique had no knowledge of any trip and had been trying to contact Alberto for the past 2 days regarding urgent business matters. Enrique immediately decided to alert the authorities. On the morning of June 19th, he went to the Belo Horizonte police station to officially report the family's disappearance. The case was assigned to Detective Sebastio Perez Rodriguez, a seasoned 45-year-old investigator who had handled numerous complex cases over his 20-year career in the civil police. Detective Sebastio listened carefully to Enrique's account, taking detailed notes in his black notebook, which he always carried. He asked specific questions about the family's habits, relationships, potential enemies, and the financial state of their businesses. Enrique provided all the information he had, but admitted that he had grown somewhat distant from Alberto in recent months due to disagreements over business expansion. The first official action of the investigation was to send a team to the farm. Inspector Carlos Mendez, a meticulous officer known for his attention to detail, arrived on the property on the afternoon of June 20th, accompanied by 2 assistant investigators. They found Jose Antonio and Maria dos Dores extremely anxious but cooperative, providing all the information requested. The Monteverde home was thoroughly inspected. There were no signs of struggle or violence. The family's personal belongings remained in their usual places, except for a few clothes and items clearly packed for travel. On the kitchen table were the plates and cups from the breakfast on June 15th, washed and organized by Maria dos Dores, yet serving as silent testimony to the normalcy of that final morning. Alberto's office received particular scrutiny. Inspector Carlos Mendez noted that the safe was open and seemingly empty, but there were no signs of forced entry. Some documents were scattered across the desk, as if consulted in a rush. A leather-bound agenda lay open, its pages partially filled with notes, appointments, and names, a subtle clue, but nothing that immediately explained the disappearance. Open page corresponding to the week of June 15th, but there were no notes about any trips or special appointments. Jose Antonio was interrogated for more than 3 hours. He provided precise details about the family's routine, described the events of the morning of June 15th in minute detail, and mentioned the visit from the 2 men in the black Ford Galaxy. His description of the visitors was carefully recorded. The older man was approximately 50 years old, with gray hair, a well-tailored dark suit, and a small scar on his right hand. The younger man had remained by the car and was not seen clearly. Maria das Dores confirmed all of Jose Antonio's details and added information about the family's behavior as they prepared for the trip. She emphasized that Alberto seemed very worried, that Esperanza asked questions the husband would not answer, and that the children seemed confused by the rush to depart. Maria also found it strange that Alberto did not take more luggage, considering he always traveled with several suitcases when away on business. The investigation quickly expanded to surrounding cities. Gas stations, hotels, restaurants, and rest stops along major highways were contacted. Photographs of the family and the blue Chevrolet Bel Air were distributed, along with the license plate number MG7423, in all information bulletins sent to police stations throughout the state. In the first days of the investigation, a few promising leads appeared. A gas station attendant on the highway connecting Belo Horizonte to Rio de Janeiro claimed to have seen a car similar to the Monteverdes on the afternoon of June 15th. His description of the family partially matched, but he could not be completely certain. An employee at a guest house in Juiz de Fora reported receiving a phone call from a man inquiring about room availability for a family with 3 children, but the call was interrupted before a reservation could be made. The local community mobilized impressively to assist with the search. Neighboring farmers organized groups that combed the region for miles, exploring side roads, cattle trails, and even dense forested areas. The local Catholic church, where the Monteverde family had attended Sunday Mass for over 15 years, organized prayer chains, and enlisted parishes from across the region. Father Antonio Silva, who knew the family intimately and had baptized all 3 children, provided valuable information to the police. According to the priest, Alberto was a religious and upright man, but in recent months had appeared troubled during confessions. Esperanza had sought spiritual guidance several times, mentioning concerns about changes in her husband's behavior, but without providing specific details. The first weeks of the investigation were intense and filled with hope. Detective Sebastio mobilized every available resource, established a direct line for tips and information regarding the case, and maintained constant contact with authorities in other states. Local newspapers began covering the case, publishing detailed reports that kept the public informed about the progress of the search. However, as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, reality began to assert itself. Early leads proved false or inconclusive. The gas station attendant who claimed to have seen the Monteverdes later admitted under rigorous questioning that he was not certain about the identification. The Juiz de Fora guest house employee could never be located again to confirm the phone call. The blue Chevrolet Bel Air was never found, despite extensive searches covering thousands of kilometers of highways across multiple states. Police considered the possibility that the car had been destroyed or abandoned in a remote location, but no physical evidence emerged. Experts in missing person investigations began to suspect that the family had been victims of a planned crime, possibly connected to Alberto's business dealings. Years dragged on without a single concrete lead. The official investigation remained active for 5 years, but with diminishing resources and declining hope of success. Detective Sebastio retired in 1970, passing the case to his successors, who inherited a voluminous file but no clear direction on how to proceed. The mystery of the Monteverde family became one of the most enduring enigmas in Minas Gerais. Neighbors whispered theories. Some suspected foul play linked to business rivals, others spoke of a planned disappearance to escape debts or threats, and a few even whispered about more supernatural explanations given the family's sudden vanishing. Despite decades of investigations, books, and documentaries, the case remained unresolved, until 2024, when modern technology and a drone would uncover the abandoned Monteverde mansion, swallowed by the forest for 64 years, offering the first tangible glimpse into the place where the family disappeared and reopening one of Brazil's most haunting cold cases. The investigation remained inconclusive. Jose, Antonio, and Maria das Dores continued to care for the farm, maintaining everything exactly as the family had left it, holding on to the hope that one day their employers would return. Enrique Monteverde officially assumed management of the family's businesses in 1965, following a lengthy legal process to declare Alberto and his family officially missing. He kept the farm running, but he was never able to expand the enterprises as Alberto had envisioned. Enrique passed away in 1983, taking with him any additional knowledge he may have had regarding his brother's final days. The local community never forgot the Monteverdes. Their story became legend, passed down through generations. Some claimed to have seen members of the family in distant towns. Others devised elaborate theories involving kidnappings, crimes of passion, or dangerous deaths. The local church held an annual mass in memory of the missing family, and a symbolic grave in the town's cemetery received fresh flowers each month, left by those who refused to forget. During the 1970s and 1980s, amateur investigators and journalists occasionally revisited the case, publishing special reports and proposing new theories. Some suggested connections with criminal organizations operating in rural Minas Gerais during the 1960s. Others speculated about possible political involvement, noting that the period was marked by social instability and shifts in the national landscape. In the 1990s, with the advent of new investigative technologies, there was an attempt to officially reopen the case. Modern forensic analysis was applied to the evidence that had been preserved, but the results remained inconclusive. Time had degraded most physical evidence, and many key witnesses had already passed away. The Monteverde case had become one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in Minas Gerais. Criminology students studied the case as an example of a complex investigation, analyzing the methods used and speculating about potential mistakes in the original inquiry. True crime authors dedicated entire chapters to the mystery, each offering their own interpretation of the events. In 2010, 50 years after the disappearance, a new generation of investigators decided to apply modern analytical methods to the case. Using computerized databases, satellite mapping technology, and advanced genealogical investigation techniques, they began re-examining all available evidence. Their goal was not necessarily to solve the case immediately, but to organize it systematically for future research. It was during this reanalysis that an intriguing lead emerged. Old documents found in the archives of the Federal Revenue Service indicated that Alberto Monteverde had conducted unusual financial transactions in the months preceding the disappearance. Significant sums had been moved to accounts in different banks, some located in cities far from Minas Gerais. These transactions suggested careful planning rather than impulsive action. Investigators speculated that Alberto might have been preparing for a sudden relocation, attempting to secure resources and protect his family. Yet the destinations of the funds and the identities of the account holders remained a mystery. Every question seemed to generate 10 more, and the trail quickly grew cold once again. Despite these challenges, investigators noticed a pattern in the financial records. Several of the deposits were made in intervals that coincided with key dates in Alberto's business schedule. There were transfers just after payroll disbursements, after livestock sales, and immediately following large supply purchases. Whoever had orchestrated these transactions understood the family's operations intimately, suggesting either insider knowledge or premeditated external interference. Meanwhile, satellite imagery of the Monteverde property revealed subtle changes in the landscape over the decades. Trails that had been used by cattle, small clearings, and signs of overgrown paths hinted at the movement of people or vehicles long after the disappearance. Experts in remote sensing began comparing historical aerial photographs with modern satellite data, hoping to identify patterns that could point to a hiding place, an ambush site, or even a concealed structure in the forest. The Monteverde case, once considered cold and forgotten, was slowly gaining momentum again. Researchers, journalists, and amateur sleuths collaborated online, sharing tips, photographs, and local legends. New witness testimonies were recorded, some from descendants of original neighbors who had heard whispered stories passed down in families. One recurring thread in these accounts was a mysterious blue car seen near the farm on unusual dates after 1960, though these reports were anecdotal and could not be verified. By 2015, investigators had created a detailed digital reconstruction of the Monteverde property, mapping the house, outbuildings, river, and trails through the forest. This reconstruction allowed them to overlay historical movements of the family, the locations of the unusual financial transactions, and sightings reported over the decades. Patterns began to emerge, suggesting that the Monteverdes may have been lured away or guided along a predetermined path, an orchestrated disappearance rather than a spontaneous event. Yet, despite all these advances, the truth remained elusive. Each revelation seemed to deepen the mystery. Why had Alberto planned these transactions? Who were the men who visited the farm that morning? And what had truly happened to the family after they left in their Chevrolet Bel Air? The disappearance of the Monteverde family had transcended ordinary criminal investigation. It had become a story of generations of memory and legend, of an entire community grappling with uncertainty. For decades, the unanswered questions haunted Minas Gerais. And even after half a century, every new discovery brought both hope and the stark realization that some mysteries may never be fully solved. Then in 2024, after 64 long years, technology finally offered a new window into the past. A drone flying over the Serra dos Cocais captured images of a long-abandoned mansion, swallowed almost entirely by the forest. Its windows broken, walls overgrown with roots and vines, and the property silent except for the whisper of the wind. For the first time in decades, the world could see where the Monteverde family had vanished, a discovery that would reopen one of Brazil's most haunting and enigmatic cold cases. In what had once been Carmen's bedroom, dolls, decayed and broken, lay scattered among the rubble. The Chevrolet Bel Air was in even worse condition than the house. Decades of rain and exposure had reduced the vehicle to little more than a rusted carcass. Yet identifiable elements remained: the characteristic shape of the fenders, fragments of the dashboard, and most crucially, part of the license plate that confirmed it was indeed the car of the missing Monteverde family. Forensic analysis of the site took several weeks. Archaeology specialists were called in to assist with the careful excavation, employing techniques usually reserved for historical sites. Every item discovered was cataloged, photographed, and sent to specialized laboratories for thorough examination. The process revealed a complex chronology of occupation and abandonment. Evidence indicated that the family had arrived at the property in June 1960, as expected. Personal items dated to that period were found throughout the house. However, other evidence suggested that the family's occupation had lasted far longer than initially assumed. Household utensils showed signs of prolonged use, and modifications to the structure indicated alterations made over several years. One of the most intriguing discoveries was a secret hiding place in the mansion's basement. Behind a false wall, investigators found a sealed metal box that had partially protected some documents from moisture and decay. Many papers were illegible, but some preserved fragments revealed crucial information about the final weeks before the family's disappearance. Among the partially preserved documents were threatening letters from creditors, notices demanding payment of significant sums, and references to agreements that had to be fulfilled. One fragment, dated May 1960, explicitly mentioned consequences for the family if certain conditions were not met. The letter was signed only with initials, but its tone was unmistakably menacing. Other documents revealed that Alberto had acquired the secret property months before the disappearance, using a shell company to conceal his identity. He had carefully planned the family's relocation, stocking supplies, overseeing the construction of a house, and creating new identities for each family member. The disappearance had not been a kidnapping. It had been a meticulously orchestrated escape. Forensic analysis of the remains discovered on the property confirmed the identities of all family members through comparative DNA testing, using samples provided by descendants of Enrique Monteverde who still lived in the region. The 5 members of the Monteverde family were found in different locations on the property, and forensic evidence revealed a tragic sequence of events. Alberto had died first, approximately a year and a half after arriving at the refuge. Medical findings indicated death by acute myocardial infarction, likely caused by extreme stress and the harsh living conditions. His body was found in what had served as his improvised office, surrounded by documents and regional maps. Esperanza survived for another 3 years after Alberto's death, heroically struggling to keep the family together and protected. She died approximately 4.5 years after the escape, from causes that forensic experts attributed to a combination of chronic malnutrition and severe respiratory illness, possibly pneumonia. Her remains were found in the mansion's main bedroom, surrounded by the children's belongings, indicating she had cared for them until her last moments. Esperanza's death left the 3 children, now teenagers and a young adult, completely alone in the isolated refuge. Marina, about 21 at the time of her mother's death, assumed the role of caretaker for her younger siblings. Roberto was roughly 19 and Carmen just 12. Carmen was the next to die, about a year after their mother. At 13, her still-developing body could not withstand the extreme privations. Forensic analysis determined that she died from severe malnutrition and likely dehydration during a period of illness. Her remains were discovered in her bedroom, still surrounded by the dolls she had brought from the original farm, a poignant reminder of a childhood that had been abruptly cut short. Roberto survived the longest. Alone in the remote mansion, he struggled to sustain himself and care for his sister as long as possible. The hardships of isolation, limited resources, and psychological strain took an unbearable toll. He ultimately succumbed several years after his siblings, leaving the mansion empty, a silent tomb of the family's tragic saga. The forensic timeline established that the family had lived in secrecy for years, hidden away from society, gradually succumbing to disease, starvation, and despair. Every room, every artifact, and every document told the story of lives spent in meticulous planning and desperate survival, revealing a truth far stranger and more tragic than anyone could have imagined when the family vanished in June of 1960. The discovery of the mansion and the remains provided closure for decades of speculation, yet it also raised new questions. How had Alberto managed to conceal his family so effectively for so long? Who, if anyone, knew of their existence during those years? And most hauntingly, what drove a man with a prosperous life, loving family, and thriving business to undertake such a drastic, secretive exile? The mansion, overgrown and decaying, became a haunting testament to the lengths a man would go to protect his family from unseen threats. The Monteverde story, once lost to time and myth, had returned as a tangible reality, a tale of foresight, sacrifice, and heartbreak etched into the forests of Minas Gerais, reminding the world that some secrets, buried for decades, endure far beyond the reach of history. He survived for another 2 years, but eventually succumbed to the impossible conditions. At the age of 21, he died from what experts believe was a severe, untreated infection, possibly caused by a wound that had failed to heal properly without medical care. His remains were found near the river that ran through the property, suggesting he may have been attempting to fetch water or fish when he became ill. Marina was the last survivor, carrying the unbearable weight of having lost her entire family. She lived alone in the deteriorating mansion for approximately a year and a half after Roberto's death. Her remains were discovered in the library, the room that had once been her mother's dream, surrounded by the books she had loved to read. Marina was only 25 years old when she died, roughly 8 years after the family's initial disappearance. Marina's diary, found in a drawer protected from moisture, provided the most poignant and detailed account of the Monteverde family's final years. The pages, written with handwriting that grew increasingly shaky over time, documented the gradual deterioration of their living conditions, the heroic effort to maintain hope, and the unwavering love that held the family together, even in the most desperate circumstances. In her last entries, Marina wrote about her decision to remain in the property even after everyone else had died. She expressed the hope that someday someone would find the house and uncover the truth about what had happened to the Monteverdis. "Let our story serve as a warning," she wrote. She detailed the dangers of getting involved with unscrupulous people and spoke of the love that had kept them united until the very end. The full revelation of the case shocked all of Brazil. The story of a family that had voluntarily disappeared to escape criminal threats, only to die slowly in isolation, deeply touched the national conscience. Media outlets across the country covered the discovery extensively, and the abandoned property became a site of public interest for those wishing to understand the human tragedy behind the mystery. Subsequent investigations revealed more about the threats that had forced the family to flee. Alberto had become involved with ruthless investors who employed violent methods to ensure repayment of their loans. When Alberto's business began to struggle due to a prolonged drought that hit the region in 1959, these creditors intensified their pressure, eventually threatening the safety of his family directly. The visit of the two men in the black Ford Galaxy on the morning of June 15th had been the final ultimatum. Alberto was given just 24 hours to repay debts amounting to a fortune impossible to gather in such a short time, or face irreversible consequences for himself and his family. With no immediate means to pay, and genuinely fearing for the lives of Esperança and the children, he activated his emergency escape plan, taking everyone to the secret property he had prepared specifically for such an eventuality. The plan had worked perfectly in terms of keeping the family hidden. The creditors never discovered the Monteverdis' whereabouts and eventually gave up the search, turning their attention elsewhere. However, Alberto had gravely underestimated the challenges of sustaining an entire family in such a remote location over a prolonged period. The property was more than a 2-hour walk from the nearest road, through rugged terrain and dense forest. Alberto had stocked supplies he believed would last 6 months, the amount of time he assumed would be needed for the situation with the creditors to resolve. He planned to make careful trips for replenishment, always exercising extreme caution. Yet his premature death destroyed all those plans. Esperança, although intelligent and capable, did not know the area well enough to risk long walks to civilization with 3 children. She feared getting lost in the forest, or worse, being discovered by the men who had threatened her family. The decision to remain in the refuge, though understandable given the circumstances, sealed the fate of the Monteverdis. The discovery of the abandoned mansion finally brought answers to a case that had haunted generations of investigators, journalists, and the public alike. The case captivated generations of investigators and captured the popular imagination for more than 60 years. Yet it also raised profound questions about social justice, family protection, the limits of human desperation, and the tragic consequences of predatory financial systems operating without proper oversight. Modern investigators managed to identify some of the creditors who had threatened Alberto, although most were already deceased. Documents revealed connections to networks of loan sharks that operated freely in the interior of Minas Gerais during the 1950s and 1960s, before stricter legislation regarding lending and debt collection was established. The case sparked renewed discussions about consumer protection and the regulation of loans. The Monteverdi property was eventually transformed into an official memorial, preserved as a historic site, and turned into an educational center focused on the dangers of predatory lending and the importance of seeking legal help in situations of threat. The family's remains were interred together in the municipal cemetery, at the very location where a symbolic grave had awaited them for decades. The burial ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, including descendants of Enrique Monteverdi, former residents who still remember the family, and visitors from across Brazil who had followed the story through the media. A priest conducted a special mass, highlighting the courage of the family in attempting to protect one another, even when their choices led to tragic consequences. Jose Antonio had passed away in 1995 at the age of 83, never learning the fate of his employers. Maria das Dores lived until 2008, dying at the age of 89. In her final days, she confided to her grandchildren that she had always known in her heart that something terrible had happened to the Monteverdi family, but she had chosen to hold on to hope that they were alive somewhere, beginning a new life. The Monteverdi family's original farm still exists, now managed by distant descendants. Part of the property has been converted into a museum that tells the story of the Monteverdis, displaying photographs, personal belongings recovered from the abandoned mansion, and preserved pages from Marina's diary. The museum draws visitors from across the country, eager to learn more about this remarkable chapter in Brazilian criminal history. The Monteverdi case has also become a subject of academic study at various universities. Criminologists analyze the investigative methods used over the decades, identifying both the technological advances that ultimately allowed the case to be solved and the limitations that hindered progress in earlier years. Psychologists study family dynamics under extreme pressure and isolation, using Marina's diary as a primary source of information. Sociologists and historians examine the case as an example of the predatory lending practices common in rural Brazil in the mid-20th century, and how the lack of adequate legal protection could drive entire families to desperation. The case contributed to discussions about reforms in consumer protection laws and the regulation of loans. Documentary filmmakers have produced several films about the case, each exploring different aspects of the story. Some focus on the investigative work that led to the discovery of the mansion, others on the family's life before their disappearance, and still others on the broader social implications of the events. Marina's diary was partially published with the family's permission, becoming an important historical document illustrating human resilience under extreme circumstances. The story also inspired works of fiction, including novels and plays, which, although taking creative liberties, preserved the spirit of the real events. A family united by love, separated from safety by fear, and lost forever by the impossibility of their choices. Writers highlight themes of familial sacrifice, the consequences of predatory debt, and the tragedy of decisions made under extreme duress. The legacy of the Monteverdi family transcended their personal tragedy, becoming a symbol of several important social issues. Their story is cited in discussions about family protection, the dangers of isolation from support networks, and the importance of accessible justice systems that allow people to seek legal protection against criminal threats. For the local community, the Monteverdis were never forgotten. Even before the mansion was discovered, the family was remembered in stories passed down through generations. After the discovery, interest in their story only grew. The local church maintains an annual mass in memory of the family, now not for their mysterious disappearance, but in recognition of their suffering and in celebration of their familial unity, which endured until the very end. The Monteverdi family tomb has become a site of quiet pilgrimage. Visitors leave flowers, particularly on June 15th, the anniversary of their disappearance, and in October, the month of the mansion's discovery. She died at the age of 25, having witnessed the death of her entire family, and left in her diary a reflection that is now engraved on a plaque at the memorial. We chose isolation to escape danger, but we discovered too late that the true danger lay in the solitude we chose. If our story teaches anything, it is that external threats are as perilous as separating ourselves from those who could help us. These words resonate, especially in an era when many people face financial pressures, threats of violence, or other circumstances that might drive them to consider desperate solutions. The Monteverdi case tragically illustrates how isolation, even when motivated by a desire for protection, can have catastrophic consequences. The work of preserving the family's memory continues. Researchers still study the objects recovered from the mansion, historical documents related to Alberto's business dealings, and records from the era that may provide additional context about the pressures the family faced. Each new piece of information adds another layer of understanding to this complex story. For the descendants of the Monteverdi family, who still live in the region, the discovery brought a mixture of renewed grief and final relief. After decades of uncertainty, theories, and speculation, there were finally concrete answers. Although the answers were tragic, there was at least certainty. The family could finally mourn properly and honor the memory of Alberto Esperanza, Marina, Roberto, and Carmen in a meaningful way. The story of the Monteverde family remains one of the most fascinating and poignant cases in Brazilian criminal history, not for the mystery itself, but for what it reveals about human nature, our capacity for unconditional love, our willingness to protect those we care about at any cost, and our vulnerability when confronted with circumstances beyond our control. Today, when visitors walk through the silent halls of the memorial, when they observe the faded photographs of the family smiling on happier days, when they read the preserved pages of Marina's diary, they do not see merely a story of mystery and tragedy, they see a deeply human story, a story of a family who, faced with impossible choices, did the best they could with the information and resources available to them. The family that disappeared in 1960 finally found its way back, not through the dusty roads of Minas Gerais, but through the collective memory of a people who refused to forget their story, and through the tireless work of investigators who never gave up in their pursuit of the truth, no matter how long it took to uncover.